Our first speaker of the night is Dicpinigaitis, who is a sophomore in the Arts and Sciences honors program, double majoring in biochemistry and English. The academic path that he's crafted for himself is one that is heavily rooted in science and experimentation, but also on clarity and cogency in oral and written expression. Our ability to make conclusions about scientific research is as important as our ability to articulate these findings, in his opinion. The broader extension of this is Alice's belief that medicine is something that transcends science, something that has a humanistic component as well as an objective scientific one. So without further ado, our first speaker of the night, Alice Dicpinigaitis.
All right, thank you, Ryan, for the very eloquent introduction, and of course for pronouncing my name correctly. That might have been a difficult task. So as my title suggests, actually before I begin, I also want to quickly get a shout out to my friends who came all the way to Walsh this evening to see my talk. Thanks a lot, guys. So as my title slide suggests, basically what I'm talking to you guys about today is a research I conducted over the summer, which basically assesses electronic cigarette use and coffee reflex sensitivity. This was conducted at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx, New York. And just to give you guys a brief framework about what I'm going to be talking to you tonight about, basically we're going to contextualize this, basically explain why this is important at all, why should we be concerned with tobacco cigarettes, regular cigarettes at all. Then we're going to talk about two studies that were done in 2003 relating to tobacco cigarette use as a way to understand the methodology that we used in the eventual e-cig study that was done over the summer. So beginning with the context, it's not too radical of a statement to simply say that we're surrounded by tobacco smoke here in the United States, abroad, and even here at BC. I'm sure we all have family members, even friends, who smoke. That being said, recently the FDA posted a statistic in 2008 saying that nearly 20% of Americans are involved in some sort of chronic usage of tobacco products. Now, because of its widespread usage, we're also very acutely aware of its harmful health effects. We know that smoking induces things like cancer, heart complications, as well as lung complications, including emphysema. So therefore, it's not too difficult to understand why alternative markets have opened up to allow for alternative tobacco usage, particularly the electronic cigarette market. Now, this is also of special interest to physicians within the field of pulmonology, like my dad. So my dad is a pulmonary specialist and director of the ICU at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, specializing in pulmonary critical care. So for the greater part of a decade, he's been studying what's known as coffee reflex sensitivity. And in very, very simple terms, coffee reflex sensitivity measures how easy or difficult it is to induce cough in someone, how easy it is to make him cough, in very simple terms. This is important because it underlies a very important physiological response of our bodies, using the lungs as a broader extension of the way that the entire human body works. So on this slide, I put the word science in quotations because, frankly, it's very striking that very little science has been conducted on electronic cigarettes. So one Conan Siegel pharmaceutical group said that they are undoubtedly safer than tobacco cigarettes. Deborah Arnault of the ASH committee says that they are safer by several orders of magnitude. So you can see a pattern that all these studies really follow. Again, a potential lifeboat, but no, they've not been tested or approved by the FDA. So the general pattern that all these studies follow is basically a very far-reaching statement, but also that they give this general perception that the public adopts that electronic cigarettes are this completely innocuous and categorically viable alternative to tobacco cigarettes. So in many ways, our group this summer decided to play devil's advocate in some sense to these statements being made. But before we look at electronic cigarettes themselves, we have to understand tobacco cigarettes and how they affect cough reflex sensitivity. So in 2003, my dad made a very broad hypothesis that in some way, chronic tobacco use affects cough reflex sensitivity, which at that point there was very little science done on this and very little data in literature. But again, backtracking even more, before we understand how this implements itself, or how this manifests itself, we need to understand how cough reflex sensitivity itself is measured. And it actually all begins with the red hot chili pepper, surprisingly enough. From the red hot chili pepper, we can derive an organic compound known as capsaicin, and we can see its organic chemical makeup here written on the board. And basically what happens is this white powdery substance is diluted about like 1,000-fold, and then delivered via a breathing apparatus to the subject being tested. So if you'll change slides, so there's basically a mouthpiece that's affixed to the person's face, and then this this breathing apparatus is also connected to it, and in this canister what we have is sterile air. So an oxygen-nitrogen mixture as opposed to straightforward oxygen to better simulate our actual breathing process, because then again, air is not purely oxygen, it's a mixture of many different things. So, capsaicin is extremely important because what it allows us to do is conduct what's called capsaicin cough challenge. So this graph reflects one participant's results when undergoing capsaicin cough challenge, or simply when capsaicin is administered to them. So this is basically what's underlying everything. On the x-axis, what we have is increasing dosages of that diluted capsaicin measured in micromolar. On our y-axis, we have the number of coughs induced. So if I can just transition over here, and for this particular patient, his subjection to 0.98 micromolar and 1.95 micromolar produce no coughs. But as the concentration increases, it produces more coughs. I want to draw specific attention to the C5 number, because that's the specific amount of capsaicin that's used to induce 5 coughs in the person being studied. And this C5 number will be very important later on when we're looking at the electronic cigarette study. So now, understanding how the mechanism works, we can go back to that hypothesis. Now, intuitively, we would think that if you're looking at a smoker, a chronic smoker who's been smoking for years or even all his life, when he's subjected to some sort of a stimulus, you think that he'd have a very rapid and extreme response to this and basically go directly into smoker's cough. We would expect to see, after a subjection to a stimulus, extreme cough enhancement, because I think that's pretty intuitive. But the other side of that, the converse, is that we might see cough suppression, but it was unknown. So we did the study, we subjected both smokers and non-smokers to capsaicin cough challenge, and we got the results, which are shown here. And basically, very clearly and categorically shows, again looking at the C5 number, which is the yellow dot, both for smokers and non-smokers, that they were able to withstand a higher concentration of capsaicin relative to non-smokers. So again, subjection to capsaicin cough challenge reveals that chronic smokers have decreased cough sensitivity because they can withstand a higher concentration of capsaicin before producing their C5 number. We see the markedly lower number evidenced in cough smokers seen on the right. So now we might wonder, well, what's underlying this mechanism? And again, there are two divergent hypotheses here. In one sense, we might say that, okay, over time, chronic exposure to tobacco smoke has desensitized cough receptors lining the airway epithelium. But also, it might be an evolutionary thing. Maybe people can only be chronic smokers because they're genetically or naturally predisposed to have airway cough receptors that naturally have lower cough sensitivity. So again, we administered capsaicin cough challenge to a group of chronic smokers. And then 2 weeks later, did capsaicin cough challenge again. And what we noticed, extremely interestingly, is that for people who have been smoking their entire lives, chronic smokers, that only 2 weeks after stopping smoking, across the board demonstrated increased cough sensitivity. And this is evidenced by, again, this is baseline, so this is before the smokers quit, and then this is after the smokers quit, post-cessation 2 weeks after. Their ability to withstand higher concentrations of capsaicin decreases across the board. So our conclusions from all of this basically is that exposure to chronic tobacco smoke, or chronic exposure to tobacco smoke decreases cough sensitivity, number one. Number two, that this is due to a desensitization of cough receptors lining our airway. And that also, this effect is transient, interestingly. Transient meaning temporary, because we see reversion to baseline. So now, with understanding the methodology that we use for chronic tobacco smokers, we're now going to apply this to electronic cigarette use. Again, electronic cigarette use is extremely widespread, but very little is known about it. And there's an extreme difference between exposure to tobacco smoke and exposure to electronic cigarette vapor. Again, it's not really called smoking, it's called vaping. And along those lines, basically there's no flame happening here. So there's no fire, there's no combustion. So what you end up inhaling is a combination of water, glycerin, and nicotine. So the next slide is also going to demonstrate, and of course this is what you see on the store shelves. If you ever walk into like a convenience store, I'm sure you see them. Actually, go back one second. We also decided to use the blue e-cig classic tobacco flavor because it's the most popularly used, or the most common use. This diagram shows what's going on the inside of a cigarette, of an electronic cigarette, which is actually pretty interesting. So we have our solution composed of water, glycerin, and nicotine. And what happens is this lithium-ion battery will heat up, will in turn heat the vapor, heat the solution, which then turns into a vapor which we inhale. The blue light at the end apparently simulates the smoking experience. We want to turn to the next slide. So looking at our method, looking at our specific methods here, it's crucial to understand that we did not test chronic smokers. So these are 30 non-smokers, 15 men, 15 women, who have never in their lives been exposed to chronic tobacco usage. Very simply, it's a 3-day study and basically diversion applications or differential applications of Capsaicin Cough Challenge. So day 1 was very, very simple. What we're looking at here is simply baseline cough sensitivity C5 measurement. My dad was telling me that the first time he used capsaicin, he got it in a little vial and he prepared a solution and he actually gave himself Capsaicin Cough Challenge. And what struck him as odd was that no concentration could produce cough in him. And he wondered, well, maybe my sample had been faulty, the one that was sent to me. But then one of his colleagues entered the room, and only upon entering the room, he began having a huge coughing fit. So number one, what this demonstrated was that the sample was not faulty. But that also all of us, perhaps all of us in this room, have a different cough reflex sensitivity. So what's critical to understand is that the cough reflex sensitivity number intrinsic to us doesn't really mean anything. In every Capsaicin Cough Challenge, every person is his own control. So again, on day 1, what we're looking at is simply baseline cough sensitivity for every participant in the study. Again, measuring C5, the amount of capsaicin needed to produce 5 coughs in the person. Now, day 2 was the most active day when the actual e-cig vaping session happened. Now, the methodology underlying this was basically the participants are going to take 30 puffs of the electronic cigarette 30 seconds apart. And this 30 puff number was not decided arbitrarily. Basically, 30 puffs is about equal to the amount of nicotine you'll be exposed to if you were to smoke 1 tobacco cigarette. So that's the reason why we chose 30 as opposed to any other number. So 15 minutes after that, they're going to undergo Capsaicin Cough Challenge once again to demonstrate if there's any effect on cough reflex sensitivity immediately after exposure to this electronic cigarette. One thing that I noticed when we were actually giving people the electronic cigarette is a few people simply had no idea what they were doing. And if you don't draw it appropriately, you're not going to allow the vapor to coat the airway epithelium appropriately. And of course, it's not going to be pulled down into the lungs as much as you would like it to. On the other hand, we have people who were actually pretty adept at what they were doing. So there's a differential aptitude that we saw there, which might contribute to some source of error if that would need to be examined at some point. So on day 3, or the purpose of day 3 was now to look at C5, again administering Capsaicin Cough Challenge 24 hours after the original e-cig session, to look if this is going to end up being a transient effect, much like the one we saw in 2004 when we were looking at chronic smokers after looking at chronic smokers in their post-cessation period 2 weeks after stopping smoking. So we compiled our results, and we actually ended up getting extremely clear and statistically significant results. And basically, each dot here represents 1 day of the e-cig study, which is referenced on the x-axis. And of course, on the y-axis, we have the log C5, so the amount of capsaicin that produced 5 coughs in every participant. So for the baseline cough sensitivity, the 30 participants had an average of about 0.5. But then staggeringly, what happened is only 15 minutes after exposure showed a marked decrease in cough sensitivity with the ability to withstand more capsaicin. And then 24 hours, we see a reversion pretty much back to baseline. I can say back to baseline because there's a statistically insignificant difference between these last 2 dots, or between the first baseline and then the final post-e-cig measurement. So why does this matter at all? Well, pretty remarkably, we've shown that almost instantly after exposure to electronic cigarettes, they have produced a very profound physiological effect after brief exposure. Across the board decrease in cough sensitivity is shown by the fact that they could withstand a higher capsaicin concentration to produce C5. And the reason why this is and also that this effect is transient because we see a reversion back to baseline. Again, this is extremely important because it has effectively dispelled the popular claim that e-cigs are this benign inert substance and a completely safe and viable alternative to regular tobacco cigarettes. However, looking to the future, the clinical significance itself remains to be elucidated. So it's stuff we'll have to look to in the future. So what's next? Well, e-cigs are still relatively new, so the notion that there's a chronic e-cig user out there is still pretty far-fetched. But it might be interesting to look at the differential cough sensitivities of people who have been using e-cigs for maybe a month or 2 or even a year. Now, a study that's being conducted now is doing the same e-cig study as this one, but now removing nicotine from the electronic cigarette. And provisional data have actually shown that there is no difference between baseline and the Capsaicin Cough Challenge conducted after exposure to the e-cig without nicotine, indicating that perhaps it's nicotine itself that's causing the desensitization of the airway receptors. So this is, again, something to be studied later on. And then moving on to my final slide, again, as Ryan mentioned in my introduction very eloquently, I do believe that there's a reflective and humanistic component to all this. So again, there's something bigger at work here than simply numbers and graphs. So this summer, I conducted both clinical and lab research, and they're extremely different experiences. I feel like obviously there's a much more intimate component to clinical research because you're dealing with actual people. But also just logistically speaking, I feel like in the lab, when you're working with mice or flies, the mice and flies get there exactly when you want them to, but that doesn't always work with people. So a lot of times what you'll see is you have to accommodate to people's schedules, and it's not always as clean and easy as lab research is in terms of actual participants in the study. And one thing that actually struck me particularly was we had one medical professional. I don't remember if she was a nurse or a physician, but she was participating in the study, and generically participants will get about $200 for completing the study. And she was like baffled that she was even being offered money, essentially refusing payment for this. And I think this speaks to a broader, without getting overly sentimental, a broader conviction of medical faculty that there's something bigger at work here than simply what's being done in their own labs or in their own lives. As a broader way of saying that in a society where we think that a lot of medical professionals are sort of cold and calculating, that there is perhaps a more sensitive component to them as well. And I know, of course, that he wouldn't want me to say this about him, but working day to day with my dad, who's an absolute genius, and being able to observe his extreme hard work firsthand, again, of someone who's a leader in pulmonary medicine today, was just an unbelievable experience that yielded extremely fruitful results across the board, and we look forward to looking at future studies in the future. We look forward to looking at studies in the future. Thank you.